Her knee is impossible. It pushes forward against the fabric of her robe with enough weight that the cloth folds the way cloth actually folds around a body that has mass and settles into a seat under the pull of gravity. Nothing else in the painting behaves this way. The gold behind her is flat and infinite, a field of beaten leaf with no depth and no light source of its own. The angels kneeling at her feet are arranged like a pattern, symmetrical, nearly decorative, each one almost a mirror of the one across from it. But she is different. Her shoulders carry the slight rotation of a body settling its weight to one side. Her hands hold the child with the particular tension of someone actually supporting something heavy, not merely displaying it. If you have walked through a room of gold-ground altarpieces before finding this one, you felt the shift before you understood what caused it. This is the Madonna Enthroned, painted for the church of Ognissanti in Florence at some point around 1310, and it is attributed, with more confidence than almost any other panel from this period, to Giotto di Bondone. What you are looking at, described plainly, is a woman seated on a throne holding a child while 6 angels and 2 bearded prophets kneel around her, a completely standard subject, painted a standard number of times by a standard number of workshops across Tuscany in this half-century. Almost nothing about the subject is unusual. Almost everything about the execution is. And this video is going to spend the next several minutes explaining exactly why a painting of a woman on a throne, made 700 years ago with tools this limited, still stops people walking through the Uffizi cold. Look at the canopy above her head. It is built from 3 separate architectural tiers, each one slightly recessed behind the one in front of it, casting the faintest suggestion of shadow onto the level below. That shadow is doing something no gold-ground painter in Florence was reliably asking shadow to do at this date. It is describing a light source, a direction the light is coming from, and a surface it is falling onto, which means it is describing a room, even though the room itself is never shown. Most panel painters of the period treated gold as a substitute for atmosphere. Giotto treated it as a backdrop behind a structure that already implied atmosphere on its own. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what Giotto did here, you have to understand what everyone around him was still doing. Florence, in the first decade of the 1300s, was full of panel painters working in what art historians now call the Maniera Greca, the Greek manner, a style inherited from Byzantine icon painting and passed down through generations of Tuscan workshops, with only small local variations. In that tradition, gold was not a background in the way we think of backgrounds now. It was a statement about the nature of the sacred. Holy figures did not exist in ordinary earthly space, so they were not given ordinary earthly depth. They floated against an eternal, undifferentiated field of light, their bodies rendered as flat planes of drapery, with almost no suggestion of the physical structure underneath, their faces built from repeated formulas passed down through pattern books rather than observed from life. This was not a failure of skill, it was a coherent visual theology, and painters spent entire careers becoming extremely good at it. 2 other altarpieces made within a few decades of Giotto's Madonna now hang in the same room of the Uffizi, almost as if the museum wanted to force the comparison. One is by Cimabue, the painter later writers claimed as Giotto's teacher, though the surviving evidence for that relationship is thinner than the legend suggests. The other is by Duccio di Buoninsegna, working out of Siena rather than Florence, refining the Byzantine tradition into something more lyrical and linear, but still fundamentally within its rules. Stand in front of all 3 and the differences are not subtle. Cimabue's Madonna sits on a throne built from architectural fantasy, its structure impossible to follow in real space, her body a flattened silhouette beneath patterned gold striping meant to suggest, rather than depict, the folds of cloth. Duccio's Madonna is more delicate, her face turned with real tenderness toward the child, but she still exists on the same flat gold plane, weightless, her throne a decorative frame rather than a physical object she could actually be sitting inside. Then you reach Giotto's panel, and the throne suddenly reads as furniture. It has a front, a receding side, steps you could climb, and canopy elements that overlap each other in a way that implies one is behind the other in real depth, not merely stacked in the picture plane. The prophets at its base are shown from below, their heads tilted up in a way that acknowledges the viewer is standing lower than they are, an observation about optical perspective that most Tuscan panel painters simply were not making yet. The attribution history of the panel beside Giotto's, Duccio's Rucellai Madonna is its own quiet lesson in how easily this period's paintings can be misread by later generations. For centuries, the panel was believed to be the work of Cimabue, listed as his in guidebooks and scholarship well into the 1700s, until a payment record surfaced in the archive of the Church of Santa Maria Novella, showing that it had actually been commissioned from Duccio in 1285 for the Laudesi confraternity, decades before Giotto's Ognissanti altarpiece was painted. The correction did not happen through connoisseurship or stylistic argument. It happened because someone found the paper. That single detail is worth holding on to, because it means the room these three paintings share at the Uffizi is not simply a room of similar-looking gold-ground Madonnas. It is a room where at least one attribution had to be physically proven with a document, which should make anyone cautious about assuming these painters and their students, working in overlapping workshops and often trained by the same masters, were as easy to tell apart as later art history textbooks make them sound. Giotto's panel stands out from its neighbors not because scholars decided it should, but because the physical evidence of how it was built, examined stroke by stroke centuries later, supports a genuinely different working method. Giotto's reputation in his own lifetime was not built on legend alone. Dante Alighieri, writing the Purgatorio in the early 1300s, only a few years after this altarpiece was likely completed, included a line that has been quoted by art historians ever since, as evidence of how quickly Giotto's fame had eclipsed the painters before him. Dante wrote that Cimabue once believed he held the field in painting, and now it is Giotto who has the cry, meaning Giotto who has taken the acclaim. That a poet working on one of the most ambitious literary projects of the century thought this shift in reputation worth pausing to record, in a poem otherwise occupied with sin, judgment, and the architecture of the afterlife, tells you the change in Florence's painting culture was not a slow drift most people failed to notice. It was fast enough and visible enough that a contemporary poet assumed his readers would recognize the reference without explanation. The obvious question is where this came from, and the honest answer involves both documented biography and a fair amount of legend that later writers layered on top of it. Giotto was likely born in the 1260s or early 1270s in the countryside outside Florence, and the earliest and most repeated account of his training, recorded generations later by writers including Cennino Cennini and further still Giorgio Vasari, holds that Cimabue discovered him as a shepherd boy sketching sheep on a rock and took him into his workshop. That story is almost certainly embellished, the kind of origin myth that later biographers loved to attach to painters whose actual early training left no paper trail. What is better documented is what Giotto had already built by the time he painted the Ognissanti Madonna. In the 1290s, he was likely involved, in some capacity still debated by specialists, in the fresco cycle depicting the life of Saint Francis in the Upper Basilica at Assisi, work that shows an early, developing interest in solid, three-dimensional figures occupying legible architectural space rather than floating against pattern. By the middle of the first decade of the 1300s, his authorship is undisputed for one of the great achievements of the period, the fresco cycle in the Scrovegni chapel in Padua, commissioned by the banker Enrico Scrovegni and completed around 1305. In that chapel, Giotto painted an entire narrative sequence of the lives of Mary and Christ, using figures that grieve, embrace, recoil, and physically inhabit the rooms and landscapes around them with a solidity that had no real precedent in Italian painting at that scale. By the time he returned to Florence and painted the Ognissanti altarpiece, he was not experimenting for the first time. He was applying to the more conservative and symbolically loaded format of the gold-ground altarpiece, a set of solutions he had already tested and proven at Padua. The material constraints he was working within were significant, and understanding them makes what he achieved harder to dismiss as simply a difference in taste. Panel painting at this period meant working on poplar wood, prepared with layers of gesso, a chalk and animal glue ground sanded to a hard, smooth surface. Gold leaf, when used, was applied over a reddish clay bowl and burnished to a mirror shine, then often punched with small metal tools to create decorative textures in the halo and border areas, a technique requiring its own separate expertise from painting itself. Egg tempera, the standard medium, dries almost immediately on contact with the gesso ground, which makes the kind of smooth, gradual blending that later oil painters would use to build convincing volume extremely difficult. Tempera is built instead through fine hatched strokes, layer over layer, a technique that rewards patience and discipline, but resists the soft, continuous transitions a painter might want when trying to describe a rounded form like a cheekbone, a shoulder, or the weight of drapery falling across a knee. Working in a medium that dries this fast, on a ground this unforgiving, using pigments that had to be ground and mixed fresh each session, because tempera cannot be reworked once set, Giotto still managed to build volume into Mary's shoulders and torso that reads, even from across a museum room, as a body with mass rather than a flat painted symbol of one. He did this using systematic modeling, building form from a dark underlayer called verdaccio through successive lighter-hatched strokes toward the highlights, a technique that existed in workshop practice before him, but that he pushed further than his contemporaries were pushing it, applying it not decoratively, but structurally, as if the goal were physical description rather than surface pattern. The clearest written record of how this workshop process actually functioned comes from a treatise written roughly a century later, Cennino Cennini's Il Libro dell'Arte, which describes the verdaccio method step by step and explicitly places itself within a chain of instruction reaching back through Cennini's own teacher Agnolo Gaddi to Agnolo's father Taddeo Gaddi, who was Giotto's godson and, by Cennini's own account, his pupil. Cennini was not writing about Giotto directly, but he was writing down the working method of a tradition that treated Giotto as its origin point, which is part of why art historians treat his treatise as a reasonably reliable guide to the physical process Giotto himself would have used decades earlier, even without a surviving workshop manual from Giotto's own hand. What makes this painting more than a stylistic curiosity is what happened to it roughly 700 years after it was made, when conservators at Florence's Opificio delle Pietre Dure, the institution responsible for the technical study and restoration of the city's major artistic patrimony, undertook a full conservation campaign on all three of the Uffizzi's great gold-ground Madonnas in preparation for reuniting them in a single renovated room. As part of that campaign, the Ognissanti Madonna was examined using infrared reflectography, a technique that allows conservators to see through the paint layers to the underdrawing beneath, the preliminary sketch a painter lays down on the gesso before committing to paint. What that underdrawing showed was not a finished design simply transferred and colored in. It showed a painter working through the architecture of the throne in real time, adjusting the angle and placement of its receding side panels, shifting elements to strengthen the illusion that the structure occupied real, navigable depth. In several areas, the underdrawing does not match the final painted result exactly, meaning Giotto revised his own spatial solution partway through the process, refining the throne's construction after he had already sketched one version of it. This kind of revision leaves no trace at all in a painting built from an unquestioned pattern book, because a painter copying a fixed template has no reason to argue with the drawing beneath the paint. Argument implies uncertainty, and uncertainty implies a problem still being worked out, rather than a formula being reproduced from memory. This matters more than it might sound like it should, because it tells you the three-dimensional throne was not a shortcut, a pattern copied from a workshop template the way gold ground decoration often was. It was a problem Giotto was solving, adjusting, and resolving as he worked, the way an engineer revises a drawing when the first version does not quite hold together. Reflectography of the drapery shows a comparable pattern, underdrawn folds that were later simplified or redirected in paint to better support the reading of a body underneath. Evidence of a painter thinking about anatomy first and surface pattern second, which was close to the reverse of standard workshop procedure for gold-ground altarpieces at the time. Conservators involved in the study were careful, in the published findings that followed, to frame these as working revisions rather than corrections of error, a distinction that matters because it separates a painter fixing a mistake from a painter deliberately testing which spatial solution served the composition better, discarding the first idea once a stronger one presented itself on the same panel. The distinction this creates is the one worth sitting with. In the Maniera Greca tradition, drapery folds were largely decorative, a repeating vocabulary of curved and angular lines meant to evoke richness and formality, rather than to describe what was actually happening underneath the cloth. A painter trained in that tradition did not need to think about where a knee was, because the drapery pattern did not answer to the knee, it answered to the pattern book. What the underdrawing of the Ognissanti Madonna reveals, and what the finished painting confirms, is a reversal of that logic. Giotto appears to have worked out, at least approximately, where Mary's knee, hip, and shoulder were positioned in three-dimensional space, and then built the drapery folds as consequences of that underlying structure, radiating and compressing exactly where cloth pulled tight over the knee would actually radiate and compress. This is why the fabric across her lap reads as fabric under tension rather than as ornament, and it is why, Centuries before anyone had formalized rules of linear perspective or systematic anatomical study in painting, a viewer's eye instinctively registers this figure as occupying real space, the way the two altarpieces beside it do not. The throne reinforces the same logic. Giotto did not have access to the mathematically consistent single vanishing point perspective system that Filippo Brunelleschi would demonstrate in Florence roughly a century later, and that Leon Battista Alberti would codify in writing not long after that. What he had instead was empirical observation, an intuitive sense, built and refined through the mural work at Assisi and Padua, of how receding surfaces appear to converge, and how figures viewed from below appear foreshortened. The throne in the Ognissanti Madonna is not perspectively perfect by later Renaissance standards. Its lines do not converge to a single mathematically correct point, but it is close enough, consistent enough, that it creates a stable, legible sense of a box existing in depth, which is precisely the achievement that later painters, working with a formal mathematical system Giotto never had, would spend the following century building on. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. None of this would matter as an argument if the painting were simply competent. What makes the Ognissanti Madonna a genuine turning point, rather than an unusually skilled example of a familiar type, is the specific combination of decisions it makes and what those decisions demanded of the painter making them. Consider the angels at Mary's feet. In Cimabue's version, the angels stacked along the sides of the throne are arranged in tiers, one above another, a solution that acknowledges there are multiple figures to include, without attempting to place them in a coherent shared space. In Giotto's version, the angels kneel in front of the throne at different, overlapping depths, some partially obscured by others in front of them, a choice that only makes sense if the painter is thinking of them as bodies occupying a shared floor, rather than as symbols arranged for legibility. Overlap sounds like an obvious device now. It was not obvious in Florentine panel painting in the first decade of the 1300s, because overlap requires the painter to have already decided that the picture represents a consistent three-dimensional space in the first place, and most panel painters of the period had not made that decision, because their entire visual tradition was built on the assumption that sacred space did not need to resemble physical space at all. The face itself carries a version of the same argument in miniature. Byzantine icon tradition rendered the Virgin's face through an established formula: a long straight nose, almond eyes, a small closed mouth, features assembled according to pattern rather than observed from a model, because the point of an icon face was recognizability and sanctity, not individual physical presence. Giotto's Mary has weight in her cheeks and a slight asymmetry in the set of her eyes that reads less like formula and more like observation, even though there is no reason to think an actual sitter posed for it. The effect is not portraiture in the modern sense. It is something closer to the suggestion of portraiture, a face built with the same structural logic Giotto was applying to the throne and the drapery, meaning a face imagined as belonging to an actual skull with actual bone structure underneath the skin, rather than a face built as a flat, recognizable sign. Contemporary viewers, trained by decades of Maniera Greca imagery, would not necessarily have had the vocabulary to explain what they were reacting to. But the shift from viewing an icon to viewing something closer to a believable human presence is not a small one, and it is the same shift that would come to define the entire trajectory of the following century of Italian painting. Precision matters here about what is being claimed and what is not, because this is exactly the kind of painting that invites overstatement. Giotto did not invent perspective, and describing the Ognissanti Madonna as a fully realized precursor of Renaissance space would overstate the case the underdrawing and the finished panel actually support. The throne's receding lines are approximate rather than mathematically rigorous. The figures around Mary still show real inconsistencies in scale and placement when measured against a strict spatial grid. What the painting demonstrates is not the solved problem of pictorial space, but the moment the problem was first being taken seriously as a problem, worked through by trial, correction, and revision, rather than inherited unquestioned from a pattern book. That is a different claim, and it is the one the underdrawing evidence actually supports. Giotto was not applying a finished system. He was building, panel by panel and fresco by fresco, the visual habits that later painters would eventually formalize into a system, and the erased and redrawn lines beneath the Ognissanti Madonna's paint surface are the physical trace of that process happening in real time, 700 years before anyone could see them. This is also a painting that occupies a strange position in the public memory of art history, which is its own kind of overlooked story sitting underneath the technical one. Ask a room full of people to name a famous Madonna painting, and you will get answers pulled from later centuries, from Raphael, from Leonardo, from the more instantly recognizable icons of the developed Renaissance. Giotto's name is known, largely because of the Scrovegni chapel, and because every survey course opens with him as the hinge point between medieval and Renaissance painting. But the Ognissanti Madonna itself, the specific panel, gets comparatively little attention outside specialist literature and museum wall text, even though it sits in one of the most visited rooms of one of the most visited museums in the world. Part of the reason is context. A viewer walking briskly through the Uffizi toward the Botticelli room, or the Leonardo room, or the corridor leading to Michelangelo, tends to move past the gold-ground room relatively quickly, because gold-ground altarpieces read, at a glance and from a distance, as similar to each other, formal and repetitive in a way that later, more illusionistic painting does not. The painting rewards exactly the kind of close, patient looking that a crowded museum schedule rarely allows, which means the argument this video has just made about the knee, the throne, the overlapping angels, the underdrawing revealed centuries later, is an argument most people walking past this panel never get the chance to hear. The irony is that Giotto's reputation was, if anything, inflated rather than neglected by the writers who came after him. Giorgio Vasari, publishing his Lives of the Artists in the middle of the 1500s, cast Giotto as the single figure who single-handedly rescued Italian painting from what Vasari described as centuries of crude, lifeless Byzantine convention, restoring what Vasari believed had once been the naturalistic achievement of ancient Greek and Roman art. Modern art historians treat that framing with real skepticism now, since it flattens a slow, uneven, collective shift involving many painters into a single dramatic rescue performed by one genius, and it unfairly erases the real, if more limited, steps toward naturalism that painters like Cimabue and even earlier Roman muralists had already been making. But the Vasari myth is also why Giotto's name survived so cleanly into the modern textbook, while the specific panel that might best demonstrate what the myth was actually describing gets comparatively little individual attention. Everyone learns the name. Fewer people are ever handed the specific piece of physical evidence, sitting in a museum most of them will visit, that shows the myth was pointing at something real, even if the myth itself simplified how many hands and how many decades it actually took to get there. The line running forward from this panel is not speculative. It is one of the more traceable lineages in Western painting. Roughly a century after Giotto completed the Ognissanti Madonna, the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, also working in Florence, demonstrated a mathematically consistent system for constructing linear perspective using a mirror and a painted panel of the Florence baptistry, proving that a picture could be built from a single fixed viewpoint, with all receding lines converging to one point with geometric precision. Leon Battista Alberti codified that demonstration into written instruction a few years later in his treatise on painting, giving Florentine artists a formal method for the intuitive spatial reasoning Giotto had been working out by eye and correction 100 years earlier. Masaccio, painting the Holy Trinity fresco in Santa Maria Novella in the 1420s, applied Brunelleschi and Alberti's system directly, constructing an illusionistic chapel recessed into the wall, with a precision the underdrawing beneath the Ognissanti Madonna shows Giotto reaching toward, without yet having the mathematics to fully achieve it. None of this makes Giotto a forgotten inventor of perspective robbed of credit. He did not invent the system Brunelleschi and Alberti later formalized. What he did was convince an entire generation of Florentine painters that solving the problem of believable space was worth the effort in the first place, that a sacred figure gained rather than lost authority by appearing to occupy a physical world governed by weight, light, and depth. Brunelleschi and Alberti gave later painters the tools to solve that problem with precision. Giotto is the reason painters were still trying to solve it a century later, instead of continuing to paint flat goldfields undisturbed. What the underdrawing findings confirm, taken together, is that the Ognissanti Madonna was not simply an unusually good example of an existing type. It was the visible record of a painter deciding, panel by panel, that sacred images did not have to abandon physical plausibility in order to remain sacred, and then working out, through trial, revision, and accumulated observation, how far that plausibility could be pushed within a medium and a tradition that had never asked it to go that far before. The throne that reads as furniture instead of pattern, the angels that overlap instead of stack, the knee that pushes forward against cloth with real weight, none of these were inevitable choices. Each one required Giotto to override a visual habit that had been standard practice for generations of painters working in the same gold ground format, and the infrared record beneath the surface shows him doing exactly that, correcting his own first attempts until the illusion held. Cimabue and Duccio, working within a few decades of the same panel, in the same city and the same broad tradition, did not make these choices, not because they lacked skill, but because the underlying premise, that a sacred figure should be built from the same physical logic as an ordinary body in an ordinary room, had not yet become the governing assumption of their practice. It became the governing assumption of Giotto's practice sometime in the years surrounding this altarpiece, and every painter who came after him, whether they knew his name or only inherited his habits second-hand through a chain of workshops and students, was working inside the space he had opened. The Ognissanti Madonna now hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, in the room built specifically to display it, alongside Cimabue's Santa Trinita Maestà and Duccio's Rucellai Madonna, a curatorial decision that stages the argument this video has been making: three altarpieces from the same few decades, the same city or a close neighbor of it, the same gold ground format, and one of them behaving as though it belongs to a different century than the other two. Conservation work over the past century and a half has stabilized the panel, cleaned old varnish, and, more recently, allowed the underdrawing to be read and studied in a way that confirms what close observation of the finished surface had already suggested to generations of art historians working without the benefit of infrared equipment. What survives, in the physical object and in the documented trace of the decisions that built it, is not a mystery in the sense of an unsolved puzzle. It is closer to a record, unusually well preserved, of the specific moment, a set of assumptions about how a sacred figure could be painted, started to change, tested, and revised, stroke by stroke, on a wooden panel, by a painter working with tools that had barely changed in generations, producing a result that his own contemporaries would spend the rest of the century trying to catch up to. Stand close enough to the panel today, and the tempera surface still shows the fine, disciplined hatching Cennini described. Thousands of small parallel strokes built up layer over layer until they read, from a normal viewing distance, as smooth, continuous flesh, rather than as the individual marks they actually are. Stand back, and the illusion of a solid, seated woman reasserts itself immediately, the way it must have for the Florentines who filed past this altarpiece, in the church of Ognissanti, 7 centuries ago, most of them with no framework at all for explaining why this particular gold-ground panel felt different from the others they had grown up looking at. The next time gold-ground painting comes up as a shorthand for medieval flatness, for a kind of painting that had not yet learned to see, remember that one particular gold-ground panel, made around 1310 for a church in Florence, was never flat at all. It was a woman with weight in her shoulders, sitting on a piece of furniture you could believe you could climb, looking out at a room that would not fully understand what it was looking at for another 100 years. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.